Hoi anō me te mata tātou, kia ina I tātou. Ho rāke te Māori ka ora, he ora no ihi, no ihi, no mana, no tapu. Kia tuia tahinga manako, kia manaaki ngā taonga tuku iho, kia whakaoho te whakaaro, kia whiwhita te kōrero. Kei te ira tangata nau mai, I hara mai rā koe I te whakaotinuku, I te whakaotirangi, ko tō manawa ki tō mātou manawa, tēnei ka iri hia, whāno, hara mai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tāiki e. Anō reira, kei ngā hau e whā, ngā pito e whā, me ki o ngā kokonga e whā o tō tātou whare kōrero. A tēnei, te mihi mai o te mihi mahana, kia koutou kua tae mai. Koutou e tūmanako nei, ki te awhi, ki te whakaongāwari, te huarahi, mō ngā whānau e hiahi ana, te whai kāinga, te hoko kāinga. A tēnei te mihi mahana kia koutou katoa, huri no tō tātou whare, a tēnā koutou, kia ora huwhi mai tātou katoa. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the 10th and final episode of Te Aho Tāhuhu, the Progressive Home Ownership webinar series, where we've been profiling the government's Progressive Home Ownership scheme, where we've had the benefit of the expertise and experience, very wide range manawhiri of kai kōrero. So it's my pleasure to welcome you here today on behalf of Te Matapihi and also Te Tūāpapa Kura Kāinga, Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, whom we are presenting these webinars in partnership with. For those of you who are not familiar with the Progressive Home Ownership Scheme, there's a $400 million investment currently available from the government to help families, individuals and whānau into their own homes. The Progressive Home Ownership Fund, or the PHO Fund as we'll refer to it, aims to address housing affordability for 3 priority groups, including Māori, Pacific peoples and families with children. The PHO Fund works by providers taking an interest-free 15-year loan from the government and then partnering with individuals and whānau to help them access home ownership through arrangements such as shared ownership, rent to buy or leasehold. And the focus of our final webinar here today, whānau, is on home ownership and land retention. And in a moment, I'll introduce our panel. But in essence, this episode is to provide insight for those of you who are new to progressive home ownership, who might be existing housing providers, or CHPs, community housing providers, iwi, hapu, ahu whenua, rōpū Māori. And the focus of today's session is around navigating leasehold agreements, multiply owned whenua, and providing home ownership to whānau. The episode will also cover how to access government funding, retention of ownership of whānau and iwi land assets. We'll hear some information from Te Puni Kōkiri and Te Koti Whenua Māori around key considerations when delivering housing on freehold and whenua Māori. And we'll also hear from experienced providers, some of their experience in delivering home ownership, and explore some key aspects such as the function of leasehold agreements. So at this stage, whānau, I'd just like to introduce today's kai kōrero. Firstly, we'll have Catherine Tauro joining us from Te Koti Whenua Māori, the Māori Land Court in Taitokero, where she is the Pai Manawa, the Principal Liaison Officer. Kath will be followed by Robert Macbeth, formerly of Te Puni Kōkiri. We had many years of experience with the Māori Housing Network, and prior to that, a lot of experience in community housing. Welcome, Robert. And he's recently moved into a role with Tauhara North No. 2 Trust, where he is the kaiarahi for the Tauhara Kāinga initiative. Robert will be followed by Julie Scott, the Executive Officer from Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust, who are one of the the current providers of progressive home ownership under the government scheme, but we have been doing progressive home ownership prior to that. And our final speaker here today will be Tammy Taurua, Director of Mere Limited, and Tammy will be drawing on some of her experience in developing a papa kāinga on general freehold land down in the Waikato there on behalf of Ngāti Koroki Kura, and other experience as well, no doubt. And towards the end of our webinar, we'll also be launching some new resources which Te Matapihi have just completed, which are really around how to navigate the shared ownership agreement. So it's going to be a really helpful tool to all of those who might look at taking on board this kaupapa. So with that, before I invite Catherine to share her presentation, once again, welcome, whānau. Thank you for being here. We absolutely encourage you all to take a look at this product, the scheme, which can make home ownership just that little bit, to bring that dream just a little bit closer for so many whānau. So with that, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Kath.
Tēnā koe, kia ora Wayne, thank you for your introduction. Catherine Taurua, pai manawa ko te whenua Māori tai tukarau, ki te taha tōku tūpuna whaia, te rai o rāhere te maunga, mangakahia te awa, nā te horohia te hapu, ki te taha tōku tūpuna mātua, whiria te maunga, hokianga te awa, nā te wharara te hapu. Tēnā koe. So just here today on behalf of, as I said, ko te whenua Māori, and we're really pleased to be able to be invited to present and talk a little bit about the use of whenua Māori for housing, because we know there's such a massive need out there. And I know that some of you will be looking to information on behalf of your organisation, and some of you will be looking for information on behalf of yourself. So I can indicate the key topics that I'll cover today. Using whenua Māori for housing, I guess that's an obvious one. Occupation and building, and management structures. So that's what I'm going to cover. So I've based my kōrero on what's available to you to investigate further on our website. And that link below there takes you directly to these points that I'm raising initially, because there's a fundamental need, I think, for owners of Māori land, anybody dealing with Māori land, that includes advisors and people that are assisting in the process of housing, to really understand, you know, what perhaps a particular whānau position is, or a particular owner position is, because you'll probably be aware yourself, no two are the same. So there's a need, I guess, and an invitation through me in this webinar to take some time to go onto our website, because there's quite a lot of information that will assist you. And one of the things is your whenua really ready for a build? So is it in a position where the owners are agreeing, everybody's understanding what's happening in terms of their ownership, in terms of the structures on the whenua, in terms of the whenua itself and its capacity? What happens when there's agreements to build? Are they held, is your building under a license to occupy or an occupation order? Is there finance? And we know there will be. Do things need to be created, like access ways, rights of way? So that link there talks about things like transferring or selling your whenua. Well, we know that the court is involved in all aspects of any of those sorts of activities. And when I'm talking about housing, I guess I'm saying, again, you know, does something need to be addressed in terms of who's holding shares and how the shareholding is kept? The whenua itself is your title improvement, and that means, are you looking to perhaps partition whenua? Are you looking for a subdivision of your whenua, or to amalgamate or aggregate any blocks? And there are different processes that can be followed in each of those title improvement sections. I touched on leases and licenses, so you'll be aware that If you have a license to occupy, perhaps that's a temporary occupation that you're entitled to, and it's generally, well, it's between owners and the other party, so it's between owners and perhaps a trust, and the Māori Land Court doesn't get really involved in that. We note it on the memorial. Finance, we've heard a lot in the webinar that you've maybe kept up with through these series about finance, and I won't touch on that too much, but you know, one of the issues about retaining whenua Māori is that mortgages are manageable, because if a mortgage is in default, there's a potential for it to be sold. It's sold still as freehold Māori, but it may not be sold within the whanau. And it can be sold at any price to anyone. Access ways, rights of way, roadways. Often our whenua is not ready to develop because there's an issue with access. We have a landlocked land. There's a new process in the Māori Land Court in terms of landlocked land where an application to the court for reasonable access can be considered. But again, these are fundamental elements to making sure that your whenua is ready for building. And I would urge you to go into that link that I've popped in there, just to start to trawl through that material. Take a cup of tea, because it's not a quick or an easy read, and you might have to do it quite a few times. There's a lot of information in there, but it does inform you about some of the issues that might crop up in your particular build or your development. I've made a little note there. I haven't touched on local authority housing and subdivision requirements at all in this presentation. That's another element. So the other part of the title improvement was the ability to either occupy or build on your whenua. And that's one you can look at again, because if you're looking at a one-off build, then you're looking perhaps for an occupation order. And that's linked in terms of your area of land that you're able to occupy to your shareholding being sufficient to do that. It's a straightforward sort of, you know, how many owners in the block, how big is the block, and then divide that, and you'll give yourself the area on which you'd be entitled to build potentially. But that would also depend on lots of other factors, including the block itself. So maybe a lot of it isn't able to be built on at all because it's in bush, which nobody wants to clear, or it's steep and isn't accessible, or has a waterway running through it. So what might look like a sufficient shareholding, when you then go to visit the whenua itself, you know, that might restrict the total area. Agreement of others. So if you're not a sole owner and there are other shareholders or owners in that whenua, you'll need to speak to them and you'll need to seek their agreement. And that's not always easy, as we know. Lots of whenua Māori has not been succeeded to, so even though you're able to obtain a list of owners, they're not necessarily the people that are available or actually alive to speak to. So succession is a big part of our business in the Māori Land Court, and you would need to find about those sorts of things as well. I'll talk more about that a bit later. Also, is there an entity that's in place to manage the whenua? That's a trust or an incorporation? And do the trustees agree with your plan? So in other words, has that trust already got a place and plan? Are they thinking about housing on the whenua? Have you been to meetings about that? And are you aware of whether that incorporation or trust is active and able to make decisions? Again, quite big and important issues, but fundamental when you're looking to build on multiply owned land. I've put the link in again to that particular issue of occupation and building for you to go and have a look at some of the issues that I've touched on. So just going in here a little bit more to Māori lands and trusts, Māori land trusts and incorporations, and I know a lot of you will probably maybe be shareholders in a trust or in an incorporation and be aware of their activities in terms of governance over the whenua. And I've just noted the general aspects there. if you're not in a trust or an incorporation, but you're looking to create one, then that's something that you can start to canvass amongst the owners and have meetings and actually decide to do that and put an application into the court. But just while I'm talking about applications to the court, why I'm talking about these issues today is because the process of building and getting yourself into a position where you're able to create housing on your whenua is probably going to be long, and applications to the court that are needed can be identified quite early and then filed and submitted quite early, so that it's not a excuse me, it's not something that's holding progress of your development up. You've got applications in the court and you're aware that yes, we're we're going through that process to make sure that you're in a position to take advantage of the opportunities that are around in the housing arena at the moment. So if you do have a trust or incorporation, obviously there are trustees and a committee of management in terms of incorporation that oversee and manage the whenua in line with their trust order and in line with their duties as trustees or committee of management members, and they're more akin probably to directors of a company than trustees, but certainly have excuse me, trustee type duties as well. If perhaps a trust or an incorporation isn't operating particularly well, you can voluntarily come to the court for the court to review the trust or enforce obligations. And that's sometimes is a useful activity or a useful application to file where things perhaps have not been progressing as people might want, and particularly meetings haven't been held, for example, and the beneficiaries and owners are keen to have the trust reviewed. I've just put a note in there about these entities may apply for Māori authority status from the IRD as well. I've popped that in because it's a little known fact, but something that if you are in a trust or an incorporation, the financial side of things is one also to be cognizant of and make sure that particularly the tax obligations are minimum. I've popped the link in there to where I have referred to the points above, and again would urge you to go and have a look at that for a bit more information about what I've touched on today. Okay, so in terms of the key takeaways today, I really wanted to just, I guess, highlight the areas where we're looking to both use and retain whenua Māori. That's the key. So using it for housing is, you know, a really important element that a lot of whānau are wanting to look at doing, quite rightly, and there's opportunities to do that. But making sure that you're able to take advantage of that, you're able to retain control of the whenua, and you know about what's required in terms of utilising your whenua Māori for housing. So that's what I wanted to point you towards today. And also to urge early planning. What is the plan to build and to occupy that whenua? Again, you know, it takes some time to work those things out, but that's another fundamental. And along with that is the structures that will be needed, if they're not in place already, to manage the whenua. And again, something that needs careful thought. It's easy to say, oh, we'll put a trust in, oh, we'll put an incorporation in. But again, understanding how they work, how that works for housing, and what's required to put applications into the court and get them through. So as I said earlier, you're not perhaps stymied by applications into Kotia Whenua Māori. So look, I've just popped up there our national pānui, which is down on the right-hand corner of the screen there. So every month we have a pānui that comes out and it lists all the applications before the court and the applications that have been filed that are not ready for court. So if you're ever curious about if anything's happening on your whenua, it's always good to have a look at that. It's available online, and you can actually subscribe to it and have it sent to you as well online. We also have a website, which I've referred to throughout this presentation, application. And that's my contact detail. I'm a paimanawa in Tai Tokoro, but we have paimanawa throughout the country. And I'm more than happy for you to contact me if there's anything that you'd like to follow up on, and I can come back to you or refer you on to other parts of Tukuti or other paimanawa that in your district that might be able to help you. So I hope that's been helpful today, and thanks again for coming along to the webinar. Kia ora.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. Some really valuable information in there, and noting that there's a lot on the Māori Land Court website. So it's a good first port of call for whānau. I think all of us appreciate the complexities of dealing with whenua Māori, and reflecting on the recent engagement around the Māori housing strategy, Mahi Kaora. There was a very strong sentiment that desire from people to retain land, but also to acquire whenua to support housing objectives and other objectives. Just a couple of pātai, Kath, just to round out. What happens if I call a meeting to discuss housing on the whenua and no one attends?
Yes, and that's a question that we get. I've tried. I want to do something, and I've put notices in the paper, and I've pānui'd on Facebook, and nobody's responded. And that's an issue where often, people are not perhaps present around their whenua, so they've are residing elsewhere. Perhaps there's a succession matter, so that maybe, in a block of 100 owners, 10 or 20 have passed away and not been succeeded to. So nobody's quite sure if they are, an owner in that block, even though their nana or their parent was. So one of the issues for that, because it can be off-putting. And what I would say is, if you've done what's required in terms of the rules around seeking to hold a meeting, so that means you've pānui'd in a newspaper, you have used social media publicly, you've gotten hold of the owners that you do know, and you've let them know the place, time and agenda for the hui, but it's not been well attended or not attended at all, then you can still come and make an application and point out the steps that you have taken and maybe seek some direction about what's next. So I wouldn't let that stop me, but you do have to be able to show that you've genuinely made an attempt according to the rules to pānui and hold a hui, and then go from there. But an application can still be filed.
Can't play, and it's often the case, isn't it, where
it is
disconnected from anything to do with the management of the whenua. So it's good to know that there's a way through that. Another, Kath, how can I check when the next Ahu Whenua Trust AGM will be held?
Yes, and again, we have queries about that, and it does come down to a little bit of investigative work. So we in the court don't hold the details. On our Māori Land Online website, you'll see all of the details of who the trustees may be, but you may not know how to get hold of them, and we don't hold their contact details. So where there is a query like that, you're really kind of thrown on the mercy of your whānau, maybe locally that might know who's able to give you that information. But again, I would encourage you to ask, pop it onto the social media contacts that you have perhaps. Do look at Māori Land Online to see who the trustees are, and if any of those names are familiar, or you're able to go through whānau that might be able to ask for you, you can do that. Again, unfortunately, and people do contact us about that, but we don't actually hold the contact details of trustees, even though we could, and we probably should. We don't in a lot of cases. So that's where I would, as I say, urge you to go back to your contacts, go to Māori Land Online, look at the names, and maybe ask within the whānau.
Ka pai, so you have to rely on the kumara wine for that one.
Unfortunately, and it's something, you know, in the Paimanawa space that we want to look at about how we can perhaps hold those kinds of records, because obviously as a trustee you should be available to your beneficiaries, but there's also, you know, privacy issues, etc. So that's something that we are looking at in the Paimanawa space, and getting some more clarity so we can perhaps be useful if that would work.
So thank you, Kath. Such an important issue, unlocking the potential of whenua Māori. And our next speaker has had a really important role in recent years around supporting many ahu whenua, many whānau to unlock that potential for housing. So Te Puni through the Māori Housing Network have been absolutely instrumental in supporting a range of Kāinga projects over recent years, and really I think the expert on this we're lucky to have with us today, and would like to hand over to you now, Robert. Kia ora wā.
Kia ora koutou, ko Robert Macbeth aho. Was until the end of last week with Te Puni Māori Housing Network, and before that with the social housing unit, and I've been involved in housing, particularly Māori housing, for many years. Currently pick up the role of head of housing and general manager of a new housing trust established by Tauira North No. 2 Ahu Whenua Trust, called Tauira North Kāinga, and we've already got our first tranche of papa Kāinga happening. We've got 3 papa Kāinga, just in the process of working up another 25 houses, and I'm just going to be in the process of going through the process of getting registered as a community housing provider. And also we're looking at being involved in the progressive home ownership program as well, and supporting whānau into their pathway to home ownership. My focus in my kōrero this morning is particularly around how progressive home ownership and how home ownership can work on whenua Māori. There is some light at the end of the tunnel, but there are some issues which I want to touch on. So just some general context in the context of how home ownership works for whānau Māori. In reality, most whānau Māori who are buying or building a home have traditionally done so on general title land. Obviously, that's where most of the land is, and for reasons I'll talk about, it's just so much easier. That doesn't mean that achieving home ownership on whenua Māori is not a good thing. In fact, it's a very, very good thing, but it does bring some challenges. There are challenges and complexities. They're not insurmountable with the right settings. I have to say that at the moment, the progressive home ownership settings for whenua Māori are not yet in place. And that's a challenge that we as a sector and our colleagues in the government side are going to have to work on pretty smartly, in my opinion. And I think it is starting to get some attention. Even Te Puni role in Te Aho Tāhuhu in terms of trialling progressive home ownership. All but one of those 6 trials is on general title whenua. And that says quite a bit. The one that is on whenua Māori is Ricky Houghton's Korowai Trust up in Kaitaia. That is whenua Māori. And that works on whenua Māori because there's not, because of the way the Te Puni the funding is provided, it's a rent buy model. There's no requirement of external third-party bank finance in there. And that's your hurdle when dealing with whenua Māori, is how to get external finance in, which for most progressive home ownership is a critical component. In the case of Korowai, that's not a requirement, so we were able to do it. Just picking up on some of the kōrero from Catherine, you know, our mantra in Te Puni and it's certainly the same from where I am now. It's all about the order. It's about whānau, whenua, and then whare. And I think there's always an instinct to jump to the houses. But if you don't get the whanau and the whenua dynamics right at the start, it potentially creates problems later on. So building on all of Te Kokoris and my experience with Papa Kāinga, it's about that whanau, the Papa Kāinga feasibility, getting all that right before you rush into building houses. There's a lot to do. I mean, as Catherine said, in terms of making sure that the legal structures around the whenua is properly in place. She mentioned the becoming a Māori authority under IRD. Makes a huge difference. The tax rate for Māori authorities is 17.5% as opposed to 33%. So it's worthwhile getting all those settings in place. But the last thing you want is to start a housing project, even for home ownership, where there's no consensus. So that's really, really important. So I just wanted to touch on this concept because I think it's one that's always lurking there, but we need to be absolutely upfront about it. Building houses on collectively owned whenua Māori is about collective home ownership. Even if those houses are in the rental space, we talk about Papa Kāinga, sometimes are rental housing, but it's collectively owned. They are actually owned by the landowners. And then that's the distinction between individual home ownership. In our Papa Kāinga experience, where there are three types of Papa Kāinga effectively. There's those that are collectively owned rentals. They are owned and occupied by beneficial owners of the whenua. They're just under a rental arrangement, but the assets and the wealth is collective. There are Papa Kāinga where on whenua Māori, where all of the houses are individual home ownership under a license to occupy. This is where the Kāinga whenua loan scheme for individuals comes in. In all cases, Te Kokori can provide infrastructure grants there. And individual home ownership is possible on whenua Māori with Kāinga whenua loans. License to occupy, have an ahu whenua trust. It's reasonably simple to do. Just a word of warning, not occupation orders. It has to really be a license to occupy. Or potentially a Papa Kāinga can have a mixture of rental, collectively owned rentals, and individual home ownership. And there are examples across the motu of all three types of Papa Kāinga. So just to summarize, collectively owned rental homes are owned. They're just collective wealth. It's not individual wealth. Home ownership on whenua Māori, individual wealth is possible, but there is a caveat. And this is a thing that you need to take into account when you're thinking about progressive home ownership on whenua Māori. Most progressive home ownership schemes, whether it's a shared ownership or even a rent to buy, in reality assumes capital gains, assumes a house price value appreciation. On whenua Māori, that's different to what it is on general land. The story, people buy, in the old days, young people would buy a starter house. They would live in it for a few years, then they would trade up and trade up and trade up. The concept is you buy in low cost and you build up and eventually you own a more expensive house. And that's premised on buying, selling. And also it's premised on the fact that alongside the repayment of a mortgage, the house value is increasing exponentially as well. So that your individual wealth is increasing. Now on whenua Māori, that doesn't happen in the same way. It's not to say that the house is not valued and valuable, but it doesn't appreciate in the same way because there's not that capacity to sell it. If it's on whenua Māori, you have to basically sell the house to someone who has a right to a license to occupy. And therefore the market for selling houses is restricted, and the way the valuations in a Tauāpapa way works isn't the same. So home ownership on whenua Māori is much more than a house. Home ownership on whenua Māori is about a homestead. It's about a way of living. It's about permanency. It's about the expectation that that home is continued in whanau ownership, and you know, and the children and the children and the children. It's not something that you hold on for a while and then you sell it and move somewhere else. So that's a factor that has to be considered when you're looking at progressive home ownership products on whenua Māori. There's a jigsaw that has to be in place for home ownership on whenua Māori, and some parts of that jigsaw is in place. There are still bits that need to be put together. As I mentioned before, it's about sorting out the whenua, making sure that the tuta whenua trusts are in order, the licenses to occupy are in place. Avoid the rush to building houses without the whānau whenua dynamic being resolved. The big elephant in the room, and it's one that it's going to arise and arise and arise until we have collectively solved this problem. And when I say we, I think it's the sector, it's the landowning sector, it's iwi, it's government, and it's banks have to come up with some solutions. At the moment, access to finance on whenua Māori is pretty much restricted to Kāinga whenua loans. And they in themselves, because they are not a bespoke solution, have significant limitations. One of the limitations for Kāinga whenua loans, and which was something that we've had to raise and time again, is that it's not a home ownership assistance mechanism. It doesn't provide a home ownership subsidy. All it's doing is underwriting the fact that the bank, and in this case, Kiwi Bank, the only bank that participates in the Kāinga whenua loan scheme at the moment, can't secure its loan with a mortgage over the whenua. The land is effectively inalienable, which means that the bank can't step in and sell the lands in the case of mortgage default. So what happens with the Kāinga whenua loan is that the government, through Kāinga Ora, underwrites the loan. So if it becomes an issue of default, Kāinga Ora would step in, and the security is effectively over the house, not the land. So the houses have to be removable. Nowadays, that means the houses are generally more expensive because building on concrete slab is the standard, not on piles. So there are some limitations with the Kāinga whenua loan scheme, just in the stock standard way of getting access to finance to build houses on whenua Māori. Now, when you're thinking about progressive home ownership is a way of sharing or gradually achieving home ownership. But as its principal tenor, it requires that access to finance being in place. So until we get that access to finance sorted, it's going to be really difficult to enter into a progressive home ownership on whenua Māori. So for progressive home ownership to work on whenua Māori, which being inalienable, it cannot be more readily mortgaged, or the banks won't consider it to be readily mortgaged. So Catherine mentioned the fact that if it's freehold Māori land, if you've only got one owner, yeah, it could be mortgaged. But from a bank's perspective, it's more than just security. It's about reputational risk. And so the banks would always be worried when it gets to their credit team in the bank, they would be really worried that in the case of mortgagee action, they would be in a position of having to assume control or take over ownership of whenua Māori. And that's a significant reputational risk to a bank. So banks are very cautious. They don't want to take reputational risk. So they generally don't want to lend on whenua Māori, even if they could put a mortgage on it and could register that. So for progressive home ownership to work on whenua Māori, there needs to be an appropriate security instruments in place. There currently isn't. The security instrument for Kāinga whenua loans, I would argue, won't necessarily work for progressive home ownership. There needs to be access to bank finance, because the whole premise of progressive home ownership is that it's a provider having some share of ownership. It's the whanau bringing in what mortgage they can from the bank with a bit of deposit, and then gradually expanding their share of the ownership. So in every case, it requires a bank loan of some description. So in the case of whenua Māori, if you had a bank wanting to participate in the progressive home ownership, how would they secure that loan? And that's an issue that will need to be resolved. And I would suggest that we need to, for progressive home ownership to work on whenua Māori, we need to understand the concept of collective sharing of ownership and collective sharing and risk mitigation, probably with the landowning trust. This is probably one way forward to expand the capacity to provide access to finance carte blanche, but we need that in place for progressive home ownership particularly. Now, there is light at the end of the tunnel. I'm not, at the moment, I'm not saying that it's unresolvable. It can be resolved. We need to really put our thinking caps on and really have some wānanga and really sort this out. But there are examples of home ownership. The team wanted me to make sure that we did get across the message that there is examples of home ownership. So as I mentioned earlier on, a number of our Papa Kāinga have home ownership in place. For example, Aorangi Māori Trust Board in Waipatu in the Hawke's Bay has a mixture of whanau with licenses to occupy, getting their individual Kāinga whenua loan, and buying their house buying their house under a license to occupy, alongside some collectively owned rental homes. There's a few Papa Kāinga across the motu that have achieved that. The thing is, it's individual home ownership. It's a stock standard whānau coming in with what deposit they had. They're getting a loan for 90% of the cost of construction from the Kāinga whenua loan, and they're paying that off over 25 years. It's not really a shared ownership or a rent to buy mechanism. Potentially could be, but generally they're not. Also, as Te Puri since 2014 with the Kāinga whenua infrastructure grants, we supported a number of whānau to achieve home ownership on their whenua alongside getting a Kāinga whenua loan. Probably I'd say maybe about 10 to 15 whānau a year have achieved home ownership that way. So it's not a big thing, but it is possible. As I mentioned earlier, from our experience of Te Aho Tāhuhu, most of those trials, all but one of those trials, is on general title whenua. I'm not aware of any progressive home ownership happening on whenua Māori to date, except for Korowai Trust in Kaitaia. And as I said before, that was possible because there's not that requirement of a bank loan that to back it up, and therefore there was no bank that had to have a security arrangement or a shared ownership arrangement in place. There is some serious thinking happening. We've been talking over the last few years around housing equity cooperatives and how they might work on whenua Māori. I mean, in many respects, the concept of cooperative housing, New Zealand has the biggest cooperatives in the world. Fonterra, farmlands, fertilizer companies, New World supermarkets. So we're not actually inexperienced in the case of cooperatives, but for some reason it hasn't transliterated into housing responses. And when I look at Papa Kāinga and Ahu Whenua Trust and that concept of collective ownership, actually it's not alien to a Te Ao Māori world. So there's possibilities of actually forming sort of a cooperative, shared, collective ownership in a Māori way, and that's something that could be explored. I believe, from my knowledge from within government, that there is some serious thinking to be done, and that process has started around access to finance. Now, my personal view is that for too long, going right back to the 1980s when the first Papa Kāinga loan scheme was put in place, and more recently in the case of the Kāinga whenua loan scheme. What we as government, or what we've done, is we basically tried to adapt a Western concept of lending to a Māori concept of land ownership, and they don't particularly gel. So we've tried, it's like a square peg in a round hole. And that, of course, when you're trying to create, using a Western concept of lending and security, and you're trying to apply that to effectively communally owned whenua, it doesn't work particularly well. So my view is that the answer could include a continuation of the underwriting and Kāinga whenua loans, but I think there needs to be other ways as well. And I think the way would be to actually more actively involve the landowning trust in the collective sharing and the collective risk. Because at the end of the day, an ahu whenua trust is the one that issues us licenses to occupy, is the one that actually can step in if something goes wrong much earlier than anybody else. And you want them to step in before the bank or the government. So they can solve things internally much more readily. There's other ways that a land trust or a resource trust, and I'm thinking of Tauira North, I guess, in some respects, where we could be involved much more actively in terms of supporting whanau into home ownership, providing some basis for giving them access to finance, whether it's direct or in an underwriting way. There are ways that within our community we can potentially be much more involved. You know, in the past there's been talk about iwi bank and iwi involvement, and or maybe the next step would be to have more direct control over how finance is made available from within Māori business and in Māori community. I also am aware that other lenders now are starting to show interest, not just banks. There are other entities like community finance who are really interested in finding ways that they can provide finance on whenua Māori. So there is some light at the end of the tunnel. My view is that we need, with Te Matapihi, Wayne, to really push that a little bit faster, because we need to solve this if we're going to make progressive home ownership available on whenua Māori. So my takeaways, my dominoes moment: home ownership on whenua Māori is more than a house, and we need to understand the expectations of collective versus individual wealth. Sometimes collective home ownership, collective wealth, is actually a more practical and solution for whānau. And maybe the concept of individual wealth, maybe that's better left for general land, because that's where individual wealth can really build. But in saying that, we don't want to give away the opportunity for whānau to build their own homes on their whenua. I just keep repeating it: whānau, whenua, whare. Resolve whānau and whenua, particularly understand the whenua's inalienability and the collective ownership matters first, and only then start thinking about whare. Don't rush into building houses without setting the platform right at the outset. And just to reiterate, access to finance is a critical barrier. It is a critical barrier. It's basically a barrier at the moment for progressive home ownership on whenua Māori. And unless we want progressive home ownership to just be available on general land, we're going to have to really work hard to resolve this. And I would encourage that. And I guess from my current position, and I'm really keen to do my bit to move this along. There is light at the end of the tunnel. We can solve this problem. We're the only country in the world with whenua Māori. We've got the situation where the concept of multiple ownership was a te ao Pākehā concept onto whenua Māori. We've got to solve the issue, and the answer is not to try and keep trying to put Pākehā Western concepts onto it. We've got to come up with our own answer to make it work. Yeah, so there's my my current contact details, guys. I'm going to be in this space. I'm from within Tauhara North. We're going to be exploring this big time, and hopefully maybe in our own way, maybe come up with some ways of some examples or some potential slivers of light to help along the way. Ka pai.
Kia ora, well, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom. Whanau, whenua, whare, the mantra there. And thank you also for pointing out that on the current settings, progressive home ownership, it's hard to see it actually working on whenua Māori. We need to find a way through and revisiting the Kāinga whenua loan and how that works is going to be critical to that. So, as we know, many of our whānau are finding going back home to be the main solution, as housing affordability in other areas is decreasing. And so we need to look at innovative options. And one of the innovative options that we've seen be quite effective and still allow for collective ownership of whenua is a leasehold approach. And we have seen that work in instances on whenua Māori. And here to share how that's worked for the community, Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust. We're pleased to be joined by Julie Scott, the Executive Officer. So over to you, Julie. Thank you.
Morena, everyone, and thank you very much for having me along on this session. So this progressive home ownership model is based on a leasehold model, and we call it the Secure Home Program. And this followed on, superseded our shared ownership model, which we ran for 10 years. So the very basic premise of this program and why it was set up is it to enable the trust, that's our trust, and we're a registered community housing provider, to own the land in perpetuity. So that's the whole basis behind at least this leasehold model, at least, is that we hold the land in perpetuity. So that household buys a lease to the property with their own mortgage and deposit. At the moment, we're working with SBS Bank, but we're getting close to getting another couple of banks on board. And their mortgage can be as low as 5%, deposit can be as low as 5%, depending on if they qualify for the government's first home loan scheme. So now the purchase price to buy this lease, which is technically is a licensed right to occupy, the purchase price for that right to occupy is the cost of construction of the home. So we've separated out the land and we've said, okay, we're going to build a house and you're going to buy into the property at the cost of that home, just the improvements, not the land. And then because we've separated out the land, we say on an ongoing basis, you're going to pay a ground rent to the trust. And that's currently set at 1.5% of land value. Now, a typical commercial return on land value, you might be looking at something like 4 to 5%. So it's well below market. If we're talking about a piece of land worth $350,000, you're looking at about $100 a week. It would be up to individual organisations, be that community housing providers, trusts, or Māori iwi, as to how they determine what that percentage is. But for us at the moment, it's around 1.5% of land value. If land values keep going up, we probably would look to reduce that down a bit, because the whole purpose of this program is to make it affordable for the households. So if the percentage in ground rent is too high, then it's not going to work for the household and the program falls over. So the key aspects here is that we then retain the freehold title on behalf of the community, because we're a community-owned organisation. We hold that in perpetuity, and we've created a separate leasehold title, which the bank has security against. Critical components of this program are that it's a 100-year lease with ground rent increasing annually with CPI. That is how we've set it up. You could choose a lower termed lease, perhaps 50 odd years, and I think it would still work okay. The resale price, so say the household wants to sell, well, they have to sell back to us and we have to buy it back. So that resale price is capped with CPI, that's inflation, consumer price index. And I'll give a little example of how that might look in a minute. And like I said, it can only be sold back to our trust. And that maintains that it's maintained in ownership within the community and the trust in perpetuity. Then a new household buys in at the same time that we just bought it back for. So it's always qualifying households who are buying these properties rather than anyone else. And we really encourage households to make improvements to the property. So if they do and we approve those improvements, then we'll add that into the resale price, and we'll also include inflation increases along the way. So that encourages people to treat it like their own home, because they may be there for a very long time. At the moment, like I said, that most people can get in with a 5% deposit because of the first home loan scheme. But if they don't qualify for that, at the moment, the banks require 20% deposit. And people can also use their KiwiSaver and the Home Start grant, which is fantastic additional resources to tap into. So here's a little example. This is a house we're building in a Queenstown suburb called Lake Hayes Estate at the moment. It's costing us $380,000 to build all up. So that's total turnkey. That's, you know, your drapes, carpets, landscaping, fencing, driveways, the works. Basically, you walk in with your washing machine and fridge freezer, but everything else is there. So let's break that down. Say the household's got a 10% deposit. I've got $38,000, and they get a mortgage of $342 because they're buying it at the price it cost us to build it. So that's $380 is their purchase price. Now the mortgage repayments on that might be at around $355 a week. They might be paying rates, insurance, and maintenance of around $100 a week, and they're paying ground rent of around $100 a week. So all up, they're paying about $555 a week to live in this property. Well, if they went to the open market and tried to rent that same property, they'll be looking at around at least $650 a week. So when you compare it apples for apples, progressive home ownership under a leasehold model versus renting in the free market, it's a clear no-brainer if you're talking strictly about financially, but also about security of tenure. Here you've got a 100-year lease. We all know that in the rental market, things can change pretty quickly. Even though the government has brought in new legislation to make it a little bit tougher for landlords to kick people out, it still is something that sits there. And you're paying off your own mortgage, you're paying off your own principal on your mortgage. So at some point, you know, you can get down to a position where you've paid off your own mortgage and you might just be paying the ground rent. And then you might be in a position to transition out of this program and into the open market. And that's the whole idea with progressive home ownership. So we would like to say that this program has all the benefits of home ownership, except the ability to make large capital gains. And that's because typically those capital gains sit with the land. And here we're saying, no, actually the household's not buying the land. The land is going to be retained by the trust in perpetuity, and therefore any capital growth that comes with that land over time sits and remains with the trust. And the house, of course, remains in the community in perpetuity because it's only being ever sold and bought back by approved households who qualify under our program. Any organisation who is setting up their own program would have their own list of eligibility criteria, be that Māori iwi or whatever it is they're looking at. And we have this little catch cry. We like to say it's a nest, not a nest egg. And I think that's quite a good summary of progressive home ownership in general. Really is about giving people that security of tenure, somewhere to live, not necessarily giving them the retirement model. This a few little pictures. So this is where we launched our secure home program nearly 3 years ago, and we put 6 into a secure home there. And then we did another 4 over in Wanaka in a little subdivision called Korowai. When we do developments, we like to do mixed tenures, typically. So here we've done 4 into the secure home program and 2 into rentals. One of those is public housing and one of those is a rent to buy program. So we kind of operate across the housing continuum. And this is a really good one. This is where we got our first progressive home ownership fund from the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware about, the PHO fund. We got around a $5.3 million interest-free loan for 15 years, and that's been put into 26 secure home households. So essentially, the government has supported funding the land component of the apartments, and then the household has brought in the improvement component. It's a little bit more tricky separating the land and improvements in an apartment complex. We had to do a bit of modelling to make it work for the households, because what you'd normally see is that the improvement side is very, very high and the land component is very low. So we had to model that a little bit, tweak it a bit to make sure it was going to be affordable for the households. But that's the beauty of this program, is that you can tweak it to make it affordable for households. So the key takeaways here, guys, is that land is separated from the improvements and it's retained by the trust or by Māori iwi or whatever organisation that is in perpetuity. That's one of the key reasons that we set up the program, and so that will always be the case. Now, technically how that works is our trust holds a freehold title, and this can be used as security to HUD, which was what I was just talking about, the PHO funding. So HUD has currently has a mortgage over the 26 toru apartments, and then of course the leasehold title was created, which the bank, which is lending to the household, has security over. So there's 2 titles there, the freehold and the leasehold, and you can use those for security for whatever purposes you need. The secure home agreement is registered with the LINS as a lease, and that's what I was just talking about, is a security by the household's bank. So yeah, that's this program in a nutshell. I've gone through it reasonably quickly, but happy to take questions. And that's my contact details if you would like to get in touch. Happy to share information, learnings as we go.
Thank you so much, Julie. I think Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust are really the leaders in this space nationally around how to make leasehold work in a progressive home ownership context. And quite inspiring what you've been able to achieve down there, apart from making us all want to now come down to Queenstown. So just a couple of questions. Thanks, Julie. What happens if a household can't maintain their loan, or the trust is not in a position to buy the property back when the household wants to sell?
So in that situation, the household or the bank can sell the leasehold property title on the open market. And it's a really unusual situation that this would ever occur, but if it were to occur, that's the bank needs to have that security, so they have the right to sell if the trust can't buy it back. And if that happened, the trust still retains ownership of the freehold title. So again, that land retention mechanism is still there, but it's just the improvements, the lease that's been unsold without the restrictions of the normal restrictions of the secure home program. Okay.
Kapai. And does it, I mean, I think you've referred to this, but does it need to be a 100-year lease? Because Māori land can be restricted to a maximum of 51 years.
Yeah, I think we liked the idea of a 100-year lease when we were creating it, because it is such a phenomenally long time that you know that there's no one individual is likely to stay in the property that length of time, so it gives that true security of tenure. But I do think that 50 years would also give that, and I don't see why if there were restrictions around and it had to be 50 years on Māori iwi land, then why that couldn't be the case, and why it may be able to be rolled over at 50 years if the organisation decided that that was appropriate.
Awesome. Yeah, I see so much potential in this model. You know, not only do you are you able to provide more affordable home ownership pathways, more affordable than rental, but the community is still able to retain the whenua collective ownership. And I think there's so much alignment with a kaupapa Māori approach there. So thank you again, Julie, and thank you for your offer to provide further information to our whānau out there listening. So that brings us to our final speaker, another innovator, another get things done person. So I'd like to hand over to Tammy, who's going to share a bit about her Papa Kāinga project down in Maunga Tautari, under the Maunga Tautari there. So over to you, Tammy.
Kia ora tātou katoa. Tuatahi ake kei te mihi ki a tātou I tēnei rā. Tēnā koe Wayne mo te karaki I whakatūwhiri I a tātou I tēnei rā. O te rā ki a tātou kua hui mai ki raro I te maru o tēnei o ngā hui. Tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou. Ko tēmi tauro tōku ingoa, ko ngā tikuri te iwi, no muri whenua ahau, no te tai toke rau. I tēnei wā, e noho ana ahau ki raro I te maru o Maunga Tautari, ki Pohara Marae, I māri ana ahau ki a Ngāti Koroki Kahukura, kei te mihi ki a tātou I tēnei rā. Bit of a tough gig, fourth in the row, keeping quite a complex and extensive program to 10 minutes is quite a challenge, but like Julie, I'm going to try and nail it. I'm just going to speak on about my experience in supporting to develop, lead and manage a new Papa Kāinga program. I'll acknowledge Robert because he's in this room with us today too. Good luck with your new adventures, Rob. You were a champion, a stalwart in our mahi and our Papa Kāinga. You came with us, you rode those challenges, and here we are today. So kei te mihi ki a koe. Just a quick image. This is within Ngāti Koroki Kahukura in the top right-hand corner in the red zone. You can see the area in which I'm talking about today. I'm talking about general freehold land title. In the yellow is what is our whenua Māori, governed by Te Ture whenua, and across the road in green is another parcel of farmland. So in the red, this is traditionally was a in farm ownership, and the iwi of Ngāti Koroki Kahukura purchased this back in 2001. I just want to talk about the journey of, Papa Kāinga development. Often it's not about houses at all. And while we're in a housing crisis, I recognise that, yes, the momentum is being pointed towards getting houses up quickly. And we have diverse realities and we have diverse ways of working. So this is our sort of story. And we started, and I won't repeat anything from my previous kōrero because I had a kōrero in episode 8 about working with whānau, and some of this was there. So if you're interested in that kōrero, it's in that webinar. But basically, we looked at land utilisation as our kaupapa going forward. We had an idea about, okay, well, we've got all of these business and enterprise opportunities. We want to bring our whānau home. Where are our people? Willie Te Aho was the managing director, and through my experience and research, we came together and worked on ways in which we could look at opportunities. And we quite simply came up with the idea that if a trust, if an organisation had whenua, why couldn't we use that whenua as an opportunity for whānau and to bring whānau home? And that's quite simply the concept. Our kaupapa is kia mai ki te whenua, hei Papa Kāinga mo ake tonu nā kingi tāwhiao e nei kōrero I tukuna mai ki a tātou. This was a saying, a tongikura by one of our Māori kings, and it was basically the Tūāpapa, the grounding for Ngāti Koroki Kahukura and our mahi, kia mai ki te whenua, hold on to the whenua, to the land as a place to stand forevermore. So here's a beginning. I want to acknowledge Ro Hoskins from Design Tribe. What we set out to do was create a Papa Kāinga on general freehold land title. While it's general freehold land, it is owned by Māori. It was bought back by the iwi from the farmer who offered it to the iwi, who wanted the iwi to own this whenua again. So that's how the land was acquired. And we brought some experts in. We engaged the best. And we went with people and partners that we knew would champion our kaupapa. What we didn't realise at the beginning phase and the pre-hui phase with council was that this would be a first of its kind. We didn't also realise how challenging it would be when you quite simply want to exercise your right or your resistance to hegemony, I might just add, and occupy your whenua for Papa Kāinga. So I do see Papa Kāinga as a site of resistance. I do see Papa Kāinga as a wealth creator, not in terms of money, but in terms of hauora, in terms of whanaungatanga, in terms of aroha, in terms of your whanau. I will challenge the kōrero that Papa Kāinga is it's about multiply owned housing. It's about this or this. Actually, in these modern times, why not challenge? Why not challenge? Our tikanga is not a static process. Our tikanga is an evolution of our whakaaro, our thinking, our way of being. And I think that's what we did. This Papa Kāinga example is a contemporary response to Papa Kāinga. It's not for everybody, and I recognise and disclaim that everybody has different needs, and we through our whole kaupapa, we went and surveyed whānau to understand what our needs were. So our Papa Kāinga is a subdivided Papa Kāinga. Every whānau own their own house and land, but we did fight the definition of Papa Kāinga through our resource consent process. We were challenged, we were objected to, and we did go to full hearings. We were heard by independent commissioners and we won. And we reverted to the national policy statement for Papa Kāinga, and we challenged legally as well through the process on what the definition of Papa Kāinga were at a local government level. And we as an iwi said, you will not define or tell us what Papa Kāinga is, we will tell you. Anei mātou. So like I said, this is a contemporary response. The values we hold on the Papa Kāinga are about communal living. While we have 11 individual lots, the iwi retain the ownership of the common lot and all of the right of ways. We also have a covenant on our whenua, and it's a first of its kind shared equity model as well, because it is the first time Westpac Bank have loaned to a Papa Kāinga development in this way, whereby there's individual owners. So I love the presentation around leasehold that was shared earlier with Julie. I think more and more of that needs to occur across our whenua and our platforms. And again, that's another way of working, and we need multiple ways of populating and creating different opportunities. For our whānau, this is about intergenerational retention of wealth and equity and support and ownership. And for us on this opportunity, whānau wanted to feel like full home owners while retaining the integrity of a Papa Kāinga. So these are some highlights. We have one bespoke wastewater treatment system. I acknowledge Te Puni Kōkiri, who supported us in the infrastructure. Now, without support and infrastructure in this way, often these projects just never fly. They are so difficult to navigate. The resourcing requirements often can become overwhelming. So support through the networks and likes of Te Puni Kōkiri for infrastructure really is an enabler. One thing I can say from experience is be ready when you enter that door. So we designed our very own wastewater treatment system. We developed our own permaculture plan. We integrated for the first time the ecology of maunga tautari maunga and the rākau and taonga of that maunga back into our whenua. We developed the new financial lending model because there was nothing that existed that worked in the way that we needed to. I'll go back to the kōrero kia mau ki te whenua hei Papa Kāinga moake tonu. With that, the iwi did not want to lose interest in the whenua. So while we have individual house and land packages for whānau where we have ownership, through the shared equity model, the covenant instrument that is in place indicates that if ever you needed to sell, move on, or do something, you recognise nā te whenua, nā te iwi tērā whenua I tākoha. It was a gift from the iwi, and you recognise that that exists. So the iwi will not buy their whenua back. You will remove 1/3 share from that arrangement, and you will provide the opportunity to the iwi to purchase that whenua back first and foremost. And then through that, we offer, we recycle the model of affordability into the next whānau. So I just want to note that we didn't necessarily need a deposit for this model. The land actually became the security for the model. We were able to exercise KiwiSaver, and it was also sort of like a first. We really had to use our legal team to support us through that process, as well as the Kāinga ora grants that some of our whānau were wanting to obtain. I've spoken about the permaculture design, so we don't have fences, and like Ro talks about, fences are a restriction and a prohibition between you and your whānau next door, and that's not really how you live on a papa kāinga, where you restrict yourselves from one another. So we don't have fences, but what we do have is screening, and we have landscaping and things like that, and it's also part of our resource consent requirements for visual amenity and impacts in a rural zone. So I've talked briefly about this. All I can say is get the best of the best. So we engaged a legal team, Neverman Bennett Law, and I'd like to acknowledge him in this process, as well as Westpac and the iwi leadership. And we co-produced our model, and we ensured that whatever we did with the model that we had chosen, recognising that whānau wanted to own their own homes for forever in this papa kāinga scheme, was that we had to keep the iwi safe, ourselves safe, but we also had to make sure we were going to get financed, because it's no good developing models and you turn up to a bank and they're not going to touch you. You've just wasted your time. So we engaged really, really early, and I've mentioned this in the other webinar as well. This is an image of construction. We've been in our homes for a year now, just to let you know, but this is an image of what our whare looked like just before sort of moving in. I want to acknowledge GJ Gardner. We had one house build provider. So while we were all individually building our whare, we had an overarching master plan. I went to 17 different housing contractors. We refined that to 7, ultimately to 3, and developed the heads of agreement with GJ Gardner, and we used scale to support whānau into their own homes. So our house prices range from $268,000 for a 3-bedroom home up to $410,000 for a high-end 4-bedroom home. They're all built by GJ Gardner, and they were built. All 10 of these whare were built within 6 months. I like to tautoko Julie's kōrero about rent versus home ownership, and the transformation that has occurred with our whānau, because we have 3 single income earners, all of which obtained a mortgage through Westpac under the normal lending and criteria based on this model. This model was an enabler to allow that to occur, where traditionally it would not have occurred. So it is a game changer for our whānau when you look at rent versus ownership, and the variation, the positive variation that's left in their pūtea at the end of the day has been quite remarkable. I'll just touch lastly on collective negotiations, because I think that's really important. For us, when we worked and put whānau through, all 10 of us at the same time, we went through one mortgage broker, one lawyer at both ends, whānau end and iwi end, one financial lending institution. Now, we went through that because it was actually really hard to knock on the door and say you're a papa kāinga. There is a lot of tension within the financial lending institutions, and understanding and professional development that needs to occur. We didn't have time to allow that process to happen, so we created a think tank, and we brought in some key liaison people, and I'd like to acknowledge Fontaine, Moses Tekani, Steve and Heiko from Westpac. They cut directly through and could see the potential of our kaupapa. And sometimes, whānau, that's what you have to do. When you realise you're butting your head against the wall, don't keep banging it. Move on and break through the ceiling in another way, and don't take no for an answer. And we went with one project lead and one build contractor. I just want to play this so you can actually just see our papa kāinga completed. You can see in the background there our bespoke system. The plants haven't quite grown up, so you can't see the screening in between the whare, but I can assure you there is some screening in between the whare now. And we have 16 tamariki permanent, 24 tamariki permanently on our papa Kāinga, with that increasing. And so this is just a beginning journey, but it's one example that I think complements Julie's kaupapa quite nicely. This is a full home ownership model. And I think that's it for me, really. My final takeaways is, our model is about intergenerational equity and opportunity. It is about a sense of place forever. It is premised upon whenua, whakapapa and whanau. And I know Rob in his kōrero talked about the transition and the steps there. I talk about this in a way that's not linear. So while it's written on the paper across like this, it's actually circular. So you'll often come back around and you'll invest back into your whenua, you invest back into your whakapapa and your whanau, even once you're in your home. This is not in the home, and that's it. This is actually about occupation of whenua, moa ke tonu. Be bold, be brave in the space, and employ new innovative solutions to complex land structures. Don't be overwhelmed by the land structures. Disclaiming, I'm not a legal expert. I'm not a papa Kāinga housing expert either. I had no experience in the space before coming into it, but had a passion and determination to have whānau into homes. And so find the right people to work with and be ready for that change. Kia ora.
Tāhuhu, e kari. Thank you for sharing this inspiring example of whānau reclaiming their whenua, whānau living on the land next to their tupuna awa, their tupuna maunga and their tupuna marae. And that's what it's all about. Thank you once again, Tammy, for sharing your wisdom, experience, the ups and downs and insights from your successful project. Before we close up, I do just want to make mention of these new resources that are now available from Te Matapihi that have been developed in conjunction with the Tūāpapa Kura Kāinga and Kāinga Order. So this resource package came about from the mahi that we did to support the Tūāpapa Kura Kāinga and Kāinga Order to develop the shared ownership agreement. So shared ownership agreement is one of the key tools that's part of your progressive home ownership package, and it's what's utilised with the banks and so on. And as part of our involvement, the government made a commitment that the shared ownership agreement will be available. So this will have the added benefit of a common agreement. It's available, which should see the benefit and assurance of banks and reduced legal fees. The approach of Te Tūāpapa Kura Kāinga and Kāinga Order to develop an agreement that benefits the whole sector is an approach that's welcomed by Te Matapihi and one we hope to see across more funding streams. So just to give you a quick look at one of the resources there, whānau, and you'll see that this package helps bridge the gap between the knowledge that exists within those of us that were part of the design of the shared ownership agreement and those rōpū and whānau that are coming to it fresh. So all the legal jargon has been translated into plain English, and there are lots of visual aids that support the explanation of the agreement process and its requirements. And this resource is part of Te Matapihi's commitment to see as many Māori rōpū and whānau enjoy the opportunity and benefit from the PHO fund. So there are three resources, whānau. This one here is the shared ownership agreement guidance notes. There is another document here which is a overarching presentation that can be used by rōpū to help guide whānau through the process. There's also some presenter notes that have everything, all the key information that anyone who's walking whānau through the shared ownership agreement to support them with that. In closing, whānau, I just want to again acknowledge all of our speakers here today for their generosity, sharing your time, your knowledge with all of those who are not just on the call here today, but all who might pick up our webinar series online. It's been a huge contribution, I think, not just to those interested in progressive home ownership, but those interested in home ownership full stop and getting the mahi done. So I also want to acknowledge all of the speakers, all of the kai kōrero manawhiri that we've had throughout the whole 10 episodes of Te Aho Tāhuhu, so you can see them there. I also want to make special mention of Mark Ormsby and Malo Ayu, who have been working in partnership with Te Matapihi to deliver this webinar series. And last but not least, I want to acknowledge Kirby Lee and Jen, who have put in so much time and effort to pulling this webinar series together. I thank you both for your time and your dedication. So, hoi anō whanau, ko tātou tēnā mo tēnei wā, kanuia ngā mihi ki o tātou manawhiri o tātou kai kōrero, mo tēnei wahanga o tātou, anō reira Kath, Rob, Julie, Temi, koutou mā, tēnei te mihi aura haki a koutou katoa, me mutu kaua ki tātou I roto I te reo whakamoimiti ki ane tātou. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai tō tātou wairi ki au whakaraiti. Te haro hau te atua, te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, amine.